The Veth fleet came out of jump space at 0613 station time. For 11 seconds, nobody at Kepler station knew they were there. 11 seconds of cold coffee getting colder. 11 seconds of a technician in Bay 4 arguing with a vending machine about whether she had, in fact, put in the right coin. 11 seconds of completely ordinary nothing. Then the sensors caught up with reality. Lieutenant Priametta looked at her console and said, "Oh no," in a voice that was mostly just breath. She hit the alarm anyway. The klaxon that filled Kepler Station's operations center was the kind of sound that reached into your bones and pulled. It cut through hull vibration and shift change fog, and the particular tired haze of people living 3 light years from anything they'd ever called home. People sat straight, hands found stations. Someone knocked over a coffee cup and didn't notice. Commander Elena Vasquez came through the blast door at a run, still pulling her jacket closed. Her hair was loose. She didn't care about her hair. "Talk to me," she said. Meta talked. 22 vessels had dropped out of jump space at bearing 340 Mark 17, sitting at roughly 400,000 kilometers. Tight formation, no transponder signals, no standard approach request, no communication of any kind. They had appeared, they had stopped, they were waiting. "How big?" Vasquez asked. Meta pulled up the size analysis. Her fingers moved a little slower than usual. Smallest reads about 900 meters. Largest is, she stopped. Meta, 11 kilometers. Commander. Nobody in the operations center said anything for a moment. 11 kilometers. Bigger than most cities. Bigger than anything humanity had ever tried to fight. Kepler Station itself was a quarter-kilometer tube with rings on it, docking arms like insect legs, and running lights that blinked orange and white in the dark. It had point defense mass drivers, a shield array, and a garrison of 400 Earth Defense Force soldiers. It had been built for pirates, for asteroid impacts, for the occasional territory argument with the Helian Confederation. It had not been built for this. Vasquez breathed in through her nose. She breathed out slowly. "Get me Earth Command," she said. "Get me Admiral Osman, and get a hail out to those ships, every frequency we have." The hail went out on 17 frequencies, in 12 recognized interstellar languages, and in 3 mathematical signal formats the Galactic Contact Bureau had certified as readable by any spacefaring civilization. It was thorough. It was professional. It said, in as many ways as humanity knew how to say things, "We see you, we are here, talk to us." 12 minutes passed. The response came back not through any of those channels. It came as a direct data injection into the station's communication array. The interstellar equivalent of someone grabbing your wrist and typing on your hand. Rude, deliberate about being rude. The translation software took 40 seconds. What it produced was this. "You occupy space claimed under the Veth Dominion's 4th Expansion Directive. Evacuation is not offered. Termination of this installation will proceed in 30 of your minutes. Resistance is cataloged as entertainment." Vasquez read it twice, then a third time because her brain kept stopping at the last sentence and needing to start over. Entertainment, not file, not unnecessary, not even pointless, entertainment. She had served 19 years in the Earth Defense Force, 2 wars. One against the Helian Confederation over the outer colony rights dispute. One against the kind of human desperation that comes when water stops flowing and people stop reasoning. She had lost people she respected and a few she loved, and she had built, over 2 decades, a working relationship with fear. She knew its weight. She knew how to carry it without letting it steer. She felt it now, cold and clear and honest. She set it aside. "Get me Earth Command," she said. "Right now." Admiral Kira Osman appeared on the main screen 14 minutes later. Her face was the specific kind of flat that meant she was running calculations behind her eyes and didn't want anyone watching to know what the numbers were adding up to. "Commander Vasquez, Admiral." Vasquez held up the translated message. "They've given us a countdown. We have roughly 3 minutes left on their clock." Osman looked at something off-screen. Her jaw moved by 1 millimeter. "I see the fleet composition." A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "How many non-military personnel on station?" 2,000. 416. "I started evacuation procedures when the alarm went off, but our shuttle capacity won't cover them in 3 minutes. No." Another pause, longer. "We are working on authorization for a response asset. Keep your people alive as long as you can, Commander." "What response asset?" The channel went to encryption pending. Vasquez stood with the dead channel on the screen and looked at it for 1 second. Then she turned back to her crew. Every face in the operations center was on her. Young faces, some of them. Faces that had families on the station, families back on Earth, families on the colony worlds, who would find out what happened here from a screen notification in the middle of their own ordinary days. She thought about that for exactly 1 second. You heard her, Vasquez said. Buy us time, everything we have. Let's make them work for their entertainment. The Veth Dominion had been expanding for 600 years. 41 star systems absorbed, 32 civilizations displaced or ended. Ranked the second largest interstellar power in this galactic arm, behind only the Sarathi Collective, a gap that had been narrowing for 50 years at a rate the Sarathi watched very carefully. Their philosophy of war was really a philosophy of mathematics. Identify the resource, calculate the acquisition cost, apply force and optimal ratio, move on. Emotion was a variable that introduced inefficiency, and over generations of deliberate cultural selection, they had reduced it to a background noise in military contexts. Not gone, just turned down. Commander Chiron of the Dreadnought, Absolute Dominion, was a product of that engineering. He was tall for a Veth, which was slightly unusual. He had lost one hand in the Paleth campaign 6 years prior and still occasionally noticed its absence the way humans noticed a missing key. Not grief, just persistent inconvenience. He stood at the Absolute Dominion, whose forward observation deck and processed Kepler station with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this 40 times before in 40 different systems. Small installation, aging hull sections, defensive armaments below standard, mass driver cannons, not modern directed energy systems, which indicated either limited funding or limited priority. 11,044 life signs, perhaps 3,000 with military conditioning. The rest workers, engineers, maintenance staff, families. The math was simple. It was always simple. 37 seconds before his deadline, Kepler station opened fire. The point defense mass drivers that Kepler fired were real weapons. The physics were entirely correct. Tungsten slugs, roughly 4% of light speed, accurate out to 600,000 kilometers. Against a pirate frigate, against a small attack ship, against almost anything within the station's operational range, they would have done serious and measurable damage. Against the Gaverme, Absolute Dominion, they registered as a gentle shiver. Saran watched his readout for 3 seconds. The impacts were hitting in the low single digits of shield capacity consumption. His ship's hull plating was rated for sustained fire from weapons 40 times this size. There was no danger. There was barely an inconvenience. He waved one hand at his weapons officer. First-tier suppression. Move this along. First-tier suppression was the Veth's infrastructure removal setting, designed to degrade installation capability while preserving labor population for eventual utility. It was not a war tool. It was closer to a demolition tool. 4 escort frigates rotated their weapons arrays and began. What happened to Kepler Station in the next 4 minutes was not a battle. It was an education. The first salvo hit the shield array and dropped it to 28% capacity. The second salvo hit the eastern docking arms. 2 of them folded, the metal giving way with a sound the people inside described later as a building, falling quietly into itself. The third salvo targeted the point defense gun emplacements and removed them one by one, not with fire, not with explosions, but with the kind of precise surgical impact that reached in and took things away and left empty mounting brackets where cannons used to be. Inside the operations center, screens were going red faster than people could respond. Sergeant Marcus Webb ran the damage control board. About 90 seconds in, he made the quiet decision to stop reading alerts out loud. Reading them out loud wasn't helping anyone think or move any faster. It was just filling the room with bad news. He read them silently and breathed through his nose and kept his hands moving. Hull breach, level 7, sealed. Level 9, same sector, working on it. Shields at 9%, the officer next to him said. Evacuation Shuttle 4 is away. Shuttle 6, the launch arm is gone. We need those people rerouted to Bay 3. Bay 3 is showing structural stress. Bay 3 is still there. Get them there. Vasquez moved through the room the way she always moved, like she had a map. Like there was a plan and it was only 2 steps ahead of her at all times, but those 2 steps were enough. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't stop. She moved from station to station, and her voice stayed level. And the level voice was the thing holding the room together. Webb had known this about her for 2 years. Her calm was a structural element the same way the hull was a structural element. You built the operation on top of it. She arrived at his station, looked at his board. How many out? She asked, quietly, the way she asked things that mattered. He checked the evacuation tally. About 700 on shuttles and away. 110 military transport. Shuttle 2, he stopped himself. She waited. Shuttle 2's bay is gone, he said. The bay itself. She held his eyes for 1 second. Then she moved on to the next station. He watched her go. He kept breathing through his nose. In a residential module on level 4, A woman named Danielle Park was sitting on the floor of a supply closet with 11 other people, 6 adults, 5 children, and holding a boy named Tomas against her side because he was 6 years old and his mother was one of the people on Shuttle 2, and he didn't know that yet, and she was going to make sure he didn't know it in a supply closet in the middle of a bombardment. She held him, and she kept her breathing steady, the same way she had kept it steady through her EDF basic training 8 years ago, before she'd left the service and taken the civilian contract at Kepler because the pay was better and the shifts were predictable. Tomas had his face against her shoulder. "Is it going to stop?" he asked. "Yes," she said. She didn't know if that was true. She said it anyway. Outside the supply closet, through 2 walls and a pressure door, the Veth's first-tier suppression fire continued its work. Patient, mechanical, mathematical. 3 minutes into the suppression sequence, Saran's tactical officer noted that 2 of the station's gun emplacements were still active. Saran looked at the display, 2-point defense cannons. On a station that had lost its shields, lost 3 docking arms, lost structural integrity in 2 major sections, lost most of its offensive capacity. 2 small guns, still aimed at his ship, still cycling and firing, the impact still registering as essentially nothing on his sensors. He looked at them for a moment longer than he needed to. He had read the assessment files on humans. The word tenacious had appeared in them 17 times. The files had treated it as a data note, a tendency to continue ineffective behavior past rational stopping points, a kind of cognitive error, the assessors had concluded, an inability to properly process unfavorable probability. Those 2 guns were still firing. Saran stood there and looked at them, and thought about the word differently for the first time. Not a cognitive error, not an inability to process, something the assessors had observed but not actually understood. He filed the thought away. It was not relevant to current operations. Second-tier suppression, he said. Finish this. The message arrived on Vasquez's personal command channel in the moment between the end of the first wave and the beginning of the second, encrypted with a code she had been given at a classified briefing 8 years ago and had almost stopped thinking about. 4 words from Admiral Osman. "Sovereign is going hot." She stared at those 4 words while the first impacts of the second wave hit the station. The floor lurched hard to the left. Emergency lighting kicked in, red, low, the kind of light that made everything look like it was already on fire. Somewhere in the east module, something structural gave way with a sound like a door the size of a continent closing. She grabbed a handhold. She held it. Sovereign. She had heard that word in certain corridors, attached to budget line items with too many redacted sections, in conversations that paused when she walked in because she was not cleared for the rest of it. She had asked once, early in her career. She had been told she didn't have the clearance, and she had accepted that and moved on. Because there were 100 things above her clearance level, and most of them she never needed to know. Going hot. She knew what that meant. "All hands," she said over ship-wide, her voice steady in the red light and the lurching floor, and the smoke that was starting to find its way through the ventilation. Deep hull sections. Center of the station. Emergency positions. Right now, don't wait for someone to tell you twice. Webb was looking at her. There was a question on his face that he didn't know how to ask. "Something we built," she told him. "A long time ago, when we were still scared enough to build it." She paused. "We built it instead of giving up," she said. "That's all you need to know right now." The second-tier suppression fire hit, and the lights went out fully, and the floor tilted, and the hull made a sound that was the sound of metal, deciding it had had enough. And somewhere to the east there was a pressure alert that the systems were already trying to seal. And in the dark, Vasquez gripped the handhold and didn't let go. She thought about those 2 guns, still firing at the end, registering as nothing, still firing anyway. On the deep-range sensor board, still running, still reading, pulling its data from passive arrays placed far out in the system's dark edges where nothing would look for them. A readout was updating. Far beyond the system's navigational edge in an asteroid field that had been slowly, carefully, secretly hollowed out over 31 years of classified construction work. Something that had never fired before was getting ready to fire for the first time. A barrel, 412 kilometers from breech to muzzle. In that barrel, a projectile the mass of a small skyscraper was beginning to move. Magnetic rings fired in sequence, each one handing the projectile to the next, and the acceleration was the kind of number that required scientific notation to write down and required something like awe to fully understand. The people of Kepler Station held on in the dark and the smoke and the red light. They did not give up, they held on. That had always been the thing about humans. Out in the dark, something their grandparents had started building. was about to show the Veth Dominion what that word, tenacious, actually meant when it was fully loaded and pointed at you. 31 years before the Veth fleet arrived at Kepler Station, a woman named Dr. Ingrid Solberg stood at the edge of a hollowed asteroid and looked out at the stars and said, to nobody in particular, this is either the smartest thing humanity has ever done or the last thing. Her project manager, a tired man named Yusuf who had not slept in 40 hours, said, can it be both? It could be both. It was both. The project was called Sovereign, and for 3 decades it had consumed more resources, more secrecy, more human stubbornness per square meter than any single project in human history. It had chewed through 6 Earth Defense Force budgets, 3 different political administrations that had tried to kill it, 2 directors of the Galactic Contact Bureau who had argued loudly that building it was a provocation, and 1 very thorough audit that had somehow concluded the asteroids in question were entirely unmodified. The people who built Sovereign were not idealists. They were not warmongers either. They were engineers and physicists and materials scientists who had looked at the trajectory of the galaxy, at the Veth Dominion's 6th century expansion record, at the 32 civilizations that no longer existed, at the mathematical near certainty of eventual contact, and had asked a simple question: what would it take not to win a war? Winning a war against the Veth Dominion was not a realistic goal for a civilization that had only been in space for 140 years, not to deter them forever. Deterrence required the other party to believe the cost was too high, and the Veth had never encountered a cost high enough to stop them. The question was simpler and darker than that. What would it take to make them hesitate long enough to recalculate? The answer, after 6 years of modeling and 2 years of argument and 3 years of construction planning, was this: a railgun of sufficient size and velocity to be functionally unanswerable by any known Veth countermeasure, firing a projectile at a significant fraction of the speed of light, positioned in a location no enemy scanner sweep would think to look, not a war. A statement, a single very loud, very clear statement. On the night the Veth opened fire on Kepler Station, the current director of Project Sovereign was a man named Colonel Adrian Bosch, and he was sitting in the Fire Control Room 0. 8 astronomical units from the station in a chamber carved out of rock and lined with cables, watching his readouts and waiting for a phone call that would either give him permission to fire or force him to watch 3,000 people die without doing anything about it. The fire control room held 8 people. All of them were watching their screens. None of them were talking. Bosch had been in this seat for 11 years. In that time, he had run 217 simulations of Sovereign firing, and he had never fired it live. Nobody had ever fired it live. The gun had been ready for 8 years, tested, calibrated, maintained, aimed at a series of pre-calculated firing solutions that were updated every 6 months as the models improved. But firing it live meant using it, and using it meant the secret was out. And once the secret was out, everything changed. Everything was going to change anyway. His comm officer, Lieutenant Farouk, kept the line to Earth Command open and quiet. Every minute or so he would report the current status of Kepler Station's sensor feed. Shields gone, docking arms gone, primary defense arrays gone, hull integrity declining across 7 sections, and the line would be quiet. Then another minute would pass and he would do it again. Station is reporting secondary power failure on levels 3 through 6, Farouk said. Bosch looked at the firing solution screen. He had 4 projectiles loaded, 4 rounds. The first was on the launch rails now, accelerating through the first 17 rings of the barrel, currently at 11% of target velocity. Once you began the acceleration sequence, you could not stop it, not safely, not without destroying the breach mechanisms and taking the gun offline for months. He had begun the sequence 12 minutes ago, on his own authority, because the math of the acceleration time required him to start before authorization arrived if he wanted to be ready when it was needed. If authorization didn't arrive, he would have a projectile traveling at 68% of the speed of light, heading into empty space. His screen updated. Kepler Station's eastern hull was venting atmosphere. Farouk cleared his throat. Colonel, 11 minutes to optimal firing window. I know, Bosch said. He stared at the phone. On Kepler Station, the fight had changed character. The Veth second-tier suppression had done what it was designed to do. It had broken the station's spine, structurally speaking. Half the power grid was gone. The shield array was offline. 3 of the 6 docking arms were either gone or too damaged to function. The East module was sealed off behind pressure doors because the East module was currently not sealed to anything. But the station was still there, and the people in it were still moving. Sergeant Marcus Webb had organized the remaining defense crew into 4 teams and sent them into the station's deep corridors with portable damage control kits and orders to seal anything that could be sealed, reroute anything that could be rerouted, and get any surviving civilian to the central core. He had done this not because Commander Vasquez had told him to, though she probably would have. He had done it because it was the obvious thing to do, and there was nobody else doing it. He was on his 3rd corridor when he found the children. There were 11 of them, ages roughly 4 to 12, in a maintenance passage between level 5 and level 6, in the care of a single civilian woman who had organized them into a quiet line against the wall. She was sitting cross-legged in front of them, keeping her back straight and her face calm, and when Webb's flashlight hit her, she looked at him with the kind of focus that meant she was working very hard at something. Bay 9 is still intact, he told her. Central core, follow me. She stood up and said simply, okay. Then she turned to the children. Single file. Hold the shoulder of the person in front of you. Like we practiced. Webb didn't know what they'd practiced or when. He didn't need to know. He started moving and 11 children and 1 civilian woman fell into line behind him and moved. Her name, he found out later, was Danielle Park. She had been EDF once. She'd left. She'd come back to it in this maintenance corridor, in the way that some things never really leave you no matter how far you walk from them. Commander Vasquez was in the secondary control room when the station's passive sensor array caught something. The secondary control room was smaller and lower and less sophisticated than the operations center, which was why it was still running. The operations center was on level 2, which was currently depressurizing. This room was on level 6, in the center mass of the station, between 2 pressure bulkheads that had both held. 3 screens were running. One of them showed hull integrity. One showed life sign distribution. One was the deep-range passive array. The deep-range passive array was not standard equipment on a station like this. Vasquez had requested it, and gotten it 3 years ago, citing routine navigational hazard monitoring. The real reason was that she had read the assessment files on the Veth Dominion, and had developed the habit of wanting to see further than she was supposed to need to see. Right now the deep-range array was showing her something that wasn't in the Kepler system. 11 kilometers. That was the size of the largest Veth ship. The sensor reading she was looking at was showing her a structure 0.8 astronomical units away. In the outer system, that was 400 kilometers long. She had not known it was there. She knew what it was. Her personal channel chimed. Sovereign is at 70% velocity. Authorization received. Firing window in 8 minutes. Keep your station intact, Commander. Osmond's voice was still flat, still running calculations, but underneath the flat there was something else, not relief, not hope exactly. Something older. Something that had been waiting a long time to be felt. Vasquez keyed the channel. Understood. She looked at her life sign display. 2,114 people still on the station. The evacuation had gotten out what it could. What was left was what was left. She had 8 minutes to keep them alive. Webb, she said into her comm, report. Webb's voice came back ragged but clear. Central Core is holding. Got about 900 civilians in place. Military personnel securing the deep hull sections. We've still got a section fire in level 8, but it's contained. Keep it contained. Working on it also, Commander. A pause. The Veth ships. They've slowed their fire. She checked the sensor feed. He was right. The suppression fire had reduced to intermittent impacts, probing strikes, rather than sustained demolition. She recognized the pattern from the assessment files. Post-demolition assessment. They were evaluating the damage they had already done, calculating whether the installation was sufficiently neutralized. They thought they were done. They were not done. Don't give them a reason to escalate, she said. Quiet, minimal movement. Keep everyone away from any hull section that might read as activity to their sensors. You want us to play dead. I want us to be alive in 7 minutes, she said. Right now playing dead is how we do that. In the Veth Tactical Center aboard the Absolute Dominion. The assessment was proceeding according to procedure. Commander Sharan reviewed the readouts with his secondary command officer, Vrath, who was meticulous and humorless in a way that Saran found professionally useful and personally exhausting. Shield array, offline, Vrath said. Primary defensive armaments, offline, power grid 61% disabled. Life signs, present but stationary. Concentrated in central hull sections. Assessment installation is combat ineffective. Resistance capability negligible. Saran studied the display. The station was still intact as a structure. It would need to be evaluated for labor value before a full termination order was appropriate. The Veth did not waste potential utility. 11,000 life signs had been in there at the start. Now his sensors showed roughly 2,000 in the central sections. The evacuation craft, he asked. We tracked 9 separate launches. 3 were destroyed during initial suppression. 6 achieved escape vectors. Pursuit is not standard protocol for small evacuation vessels. No. Sauron looked at the station, still sitting there, running lights still blinking on 2 of its intact arms. Emergency broadcast still cycling on the standard distress frequency, which told him the humans had not given up on the hope that someone would hear it and come. Nobody was coming. The nearest human installation was 4 light hours away. He thought about the 2 guns that had kept firing. What is the status of the evacuation craft that escaped, he asked. Minimal military value, civilian capacity vessels, short jump range. Their destination, Vrath checked, the nearest charted colony installation. Kepler 442b orbital station, 4 light hours, Sauron nodded. The message would arrive there in 4 hours and reach Earth Command in 12. He had 4 systems to process before this one could be formally inducted into the Dominion's 4th expansion directive, and he preferred to work efficiently. Begin boarding assessment protocol, he said. Prepare 2 personnel shuttles for installation entry. He began to turn away from the display. That was when his sensor officer, a young Veth named Pren who had been very quiet for the last several minutes, said, Commander. There was something in Pren's voice that Sauron had not heard before from Pren or from many Veth officers. It was a sound that did not have a clean name in the Veth language. Sauron turned back. There is an object, Pren said slowly, in the outer system. Very large. A pause. Commander, it was not there before. Sauron looked at the sensor display. The object was 0. 8 astronomical units from their current position, which meant light from it had taken 4.5 minutes to reach them, which meant whatever it was, it had been there for at least that long. The size reading came back 3 times before Pren said it out loud. 412 kilometers. Class? Sauron asked. Pren ran the scan. No known classification. The structure is, another pause. It appears to be a single linear object, Colonel. A tube, extremely long and narrow. One end is pointed directly at our formation. Sauron looked at the shape of it. Linear. Pointed at them. The Veth had been in space for 600 years. They had assessed dozens of civilizations, cataloged thousands of weapon systems, built threat models for every engagement type they had encountered. Sauron's tactical library contained information on 700 distinct weapons, platforms from 40 civilizations. He knew what a barrel looked like. He did not know what fired out of a barrel, 400 kilometers long, but he understood with sudden and absolute clarity that he did not want to find out from the receiving end. Combat alert, he said. His voice stayed level. All ships evasive. He did not finish the sentence. He didn't have time. Back in the fire control room carved from rock and silence, 8 people watched their screens, and Colonel Adrian Bosch watched his firing window indicator cross from amber to green, and he pressed the authorization key and said, very quietly, fire. The trigger completed. At the breach of a 400-kilometer barrel hidden in a hollowed asteroid in the outer dark of the Kepler system, a magnetic pulse of staggering scale released a projectile, moving at 68% of the speed of light into a path that had been calculated and recalculated for 11 years, toward absolute dominion, toward the Veth fleet, toward the math that had always said humanity was an acceptable acquisition cost, toward everything that had ever looked at humans and seen something it could take. On Kepler Station, in the dark, Vasquez held onto her handhold and looked at her screen. The deep-range array caught it, not the projectile itself, which was far too small and far too fast to see directly, but the electromagnetic signature of the launch, a spike on the sensor board so large it made the scale reset 3 times before the software figured out what range it needed to display the number. In Webb's voice came over the comm. Commander, what was that? That, she said, was 31 years of someone refusing to give up. She looked at the timer on her personal channel. 4.1 seconds until impact. 3.9, 3.7. She held on. There is a thing that happens when an object the mass of a large building travels at 68% of the speed of light. It is not an explosion, not exactly. An explosion implies a contained release of energy, something that starts and finishes a bang. What happens when a kinetic impactor at 68% of the speed of light makes contact with another object is something else entirely. The energy released is a number that requires scientific notation. The physics are the same physics as any other impact, mass, velocity, transfer, just applied at a scale that the human brain is genuinely not designed to process without models and graphs and multiple sessions of sitting quietly afterward. The projectile that Colonel Adrian Bosch fired from Project Sovereign did not make a sound that anyone on Kepler Station could hear. Space does not carry sound, but the electromagnetic signature of what happened next registered on every passive sensor array in the Kepler system, on 6 deep-range arrays that Earth Defense Force had placed throughout the sector over the last decade, and on 14 non-human observation platforms belonging to 5 different civilizations who had been quietly watching this system since the Veth fleet arrived, waiting to see how the math worked out. They were about to see how the math worked out. Commander Sarin had 4 seconds between understanding what he was looking at and impact. 4 seconds is enough time for a trained military officer to begin issuing orders. It is not enough time for those orders to reach every ship in a fleet and be processed and acted on. The physics of reaction time and signal propagation do not allow for it. He said evasive, and he did not finish the word. The projectile hit the absolute dominion at 0641 station time. Absolute dominion was 11 kilometers long. It had been the pride of Veth Dominion's 4th expansion fleet, 12 years in construction, the most advanced military vessel the Dominion had produced in a generation. Its hull plating was layered composite armor rated for sustained heavy weapons fire. It had point defense arrays capable of tracking and neutralizing 12 simultaneous incoming projectiles. It had a crew of 4,311. None of these things were relevant. When the projectile connected, absolute dominion did not explode in the conventional sense. What it did was convert, a catastrophically rapid conversion of kinetic energy into heat, light, plasma, and a pressure wave that expanded outward at speeds that made fast a word that needed a moment to think about what it was doing in the sentence. The shift ceased to exist in a coherent form in approximately 0.003 seconds. The pressure wave that followed was the real problem for the rest of the fleet. In the fire control room, Colonel Bosch watched his sensor feed, the signal that returned from the absolute dominion, whose position was so large that his display's autoscaling had to recalibrate twice, the same way Meta's sensor board had recalibrated when she first read the Veth fleet's size, except in the opposite direction and with the opposite feeling attached to it. Round 1 impact confirmed, his sensor officer said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were flat on her console so they wouldn't shake. Bosch looked at the display. Absolute dominion was gone. The position it had occupied was now a rapidly expanding sphere of plasma and debris, but there were 21 other ships. Round 2, he said. The second projectile was already at 40% velocity in the barrel. He had started the second acceleration sequence 9 minutes ago, before the first round had fired, because the loading and acceleration cycle took 11 minutes and you planned ahead. That was what you did. You planned ahead. You built a 400-kilometer gun in secret for 31 years. You loaded 4 rounds and you planned the sequence before you fired the first one, because you did not know how many you would need, and you did not intend to find out by running out. The pressure wave from the absolute dominion B's destruction reached the nearest escort frigate in approximately 12 seconds. The frigate, dominant force, 700 meters, crew of 600, had been in standard formation relative to the dreadnought when the impact happened. Its pilot had processed the sensor spike, begun to compute an evasive solution, and had gotten approximately 0.4 seconds into executing it when the pressure wave arrived. The dominant force was not traveling at 68% of the speed of light. It was not a weapon. What the pressure wave did to it was more like what a storm wave does to a small boat, not the kind of thing that ends cleanly, but the kind of thing where structural integrity and physics and the specific unlucky angle of impact all make a decision together, and the decision is final. The dominant force lost its aft section. The forward section, still technically intact, tumbled into a new trajectory that would take it out of the system within 6 hours. The surviving crew, and there were surviving crew, had approximately 20 minutes of life support. 3 other ships in the outer formation had been close enough to the absolute dominion to take damage from the pressure wave. 1 lost its navigation array. 1 took hull breaches in 2 forward sections. 1 was undamaged but had, in the confusion, separated from its assigned formation position and was receiving conflicting course signals from its own systems. The remaining 16 ships were intact. They were also, every single one of them, attempting to do something they had not done in this system since their arrival. They were running. Subcommander Vrath had been the second highest ranking officer aboard the Absolute Dominion. He was not aboard the Absolute Dominion anymore, which was why he was still alive. He was on board Assessment Shuttle 1, 60 kilometers from the Dreadnought's former position, preparing to approach the station for boarding evaluation when the impact happened. The shuttle's sensor suite was minimal, short-range, tactical grade, not designed for this. What it registered was a flash of light so intense that the photosensor protection circuits engaged and cut the visual display for 1.4 seconds. When the display came back, the Absolute Dominion was not there. Vrath sat in his seat and looked at the empty space where the largest ship he had ever served on had been 4 seconds ago. He was not an emotional being, by Veth standards. His training had minimized that variable, and he had minimized it further himself because it was inefficient and he had always preferred efficiency. He had 412 combat operations in his record and he had never had a moment in any of them that felt like what this moment felt like. The nearest word in his language was incomprehension. The state of not being able to form a category for what you were looking at. He looked at the empty space. He looked at the sensor feed, showing the remaining fleet in emergency scatter formations. He looked at the position marker for where the projectile had come from. His training reasserted itself. It always did. That was what training was for. Plot escape trajectory, he said to his pilot. Maximum thrust, outer system. Jump space entry as soon as we have sufficient distance. What heading after jump? His pilot asked. Vrath thought about that. The Dominion needed to know what had happened here. The Dominion needed to know that the humans had a weapon of the scale, and had hidden it, and had used it without warning, without declaration, without the formal statements of capability that every spacefaring civilization used to establish deterrence before resorting to direct action. They had hidden it, and then they had used it when they needed to use it. That was not how warfare was supposed to work. That was not the accepted format. But then, the Veth had told the humans their station would be terminated and had not given them the option to evacuate. Vrath filed that parallel away. It was going to need to be considered at length by people above his rank. Home system, he said, emergency priority. Flag the transmission for the High Council. On 14 non-human observation platforms, the sensor feeds had just done something remarkable. Most of the species watching had been watching quietly because the Veth Dominion was powerful enough that neutrality was the only safe position when they were in your vicinity, even when what they were doing to a smaller civilization was difficult to watch. You stayed neutral. You observed. You did not intervene. That was how you survived in a galaxy where the second largest power had been expanding for 6 centuries. On the Sarathi Confederation's long-range observation post, analyst Kashari was looking at the data her sensors had returned and doing the calculation 3 times because the first 2 times she had concluded she was misreading it. The third time she got the same number. She sat back. 1 projectile, 1 ship eliminated, the largest in the Veth fleet flagship class, 11 kilometers. 11 kilometers. She ran the energy release calculation. She ran it again. She had to look up the measurement conversion twice because the unit she needed was not 1. She used an ordinary analysis work. She sent the data to her senior analyst without a note. The data did not need a note. The senior analyst sent it to the Confederation's Intelligence Directorate within 6 minutes with a note that said, simply, the humans fired back. The second projectile from Sovereign hit the Veth battlecruiser. Eternal Claim. At 0653 station time. Eternal Claim had been one of the ships in the outer formation, 2,000 kilometers from the Absolute Dominion. His former position. It had begun evasive maneuvering 11 minutes earlier when the fleet went to emergency scatter. 11 minutes of maximum thrust acceleration. The projectile, traveling at 68% of the speed of light, had been in the barrel during those 11 minutes, already most of the way through its acceleration sequence. Bosch's firing solution had been calculated for the fleet's last known static position, then updated by his targeting team for the scatter vectors. The Eternal Claim had taken a scatter vector that his targeting officer had assessed as a 64% probability outcome. The assessment was correct. The Eternal Claim was 900 meters long, crew of 800. It had been in the Veth 4th expansion fleet for 6 years. It ceased to exist in the same way the Absolute Dominion had ceased to exist. except that the energy release was proportionally smaller because the ship was proportionally smaller, which in practical terms was a distinction without a meaningful difference. The expanding plasma sphere merged with the still dissipating plasma sphere from the absolute dominion. 40 seconds later, from the outside, from the position of the surviving Veth ships, it looked like the two events were connected, like the darkness between the stars where the fleet had been was becoming something that emitted light. Back on Kepler Station, the passive array was showing Vasquez what was happening. She was watching the display in the secondary control room, cramped, red-lit, full of smoke from a vent seal that had given way 20 minutes ago and hadn't been fixed yet because there were higher priorities. Webb was at the station next to her. Meta was sitting against the wall with a pressure bandage on her arm that had stopped needing attention 10 minutes ago, but that Webb kept looking at anyway. The display showed the Veth formation markers updating in real time as the passive array gathered data. 2 markers had gone dark, the others were moving, scattering outward from their previous positions. Acceleration curves steep enough to suggest maximum thrust burns on all ships. "They're running," Webb said. Vasquez watched the display. She didn't say anything. She watched the fleet that had come here ready to add Kepler Station to a 600-year list of things the Veth had taken. The fleet whose commander had described human resistance as entertainment. The fleet that had killed people in the East Module, and on Shuttle 2 and in the first salvo and in the second. She watched that fleet scatter across her passive array screen like something had frightened it. Something had frightened it. "Third round in the barrel," Bosch's voice said on her command channel. His voice was steady and low. "Firing window in 4 minutes. I have targeting solutions on 3 ships. Your call, Commander." Her call. She looked at the screen. 20 ships still intact, still running, still in the system. 4 ships with clear intercept solutions according to Bosch's targeting data. 4 ships that could turn around if they chose to and hit what was left of Kepler Station before Sovereign could cycle for a 4th shot. She thought about Shuttle 2. About the bay that wasn't there anymore. About Tomas, who was 6 years old and had his face in someone's shoulder. "Fire," she said. The 3rd round hit the frigate. Cold Patience. At 0704 station time, Cold Patience was one of the 4 ships that had maintained the closest formation to the absolute dominion. During the original suppression sequence, it was 900 meters. It had been part of the first-tier suppression wave. It had contributed to the destruction of Kepler Station's docking arms. It ceased to exist. The 4th round was already in the barrel. By the time it was ready to fire, something had changed in the Veth fleet's scatter pattern. The ships were no longer simply running on diverging vectors. They were communicating tight-band encrypted signals that the passive array couldn't decode but could measure. And then, one by one, the surviving ships were doing something that no human in this system had expected to see. They were jumping, not to a rally point, not to a regrouping position in the outer system. The jump signatures were deep space profiles, long-distance jumps, the kind you used when you were not planning to come back soon. 18 ships remaining in the Veth formation. 18 jump signatures in 44 minutes. Then the Kepler system was quiet. Then it was just Kepler Station, battered and bleeding and dark in most of its sections, sitting in the silence, and the expanding plasma fields where 2 of the most advanced ships in the Veth fleet had been, and the stars. The same stars that had always been there. The same dark, just quieter now. Colonel Bosch stood the 4th round down at 0741 station time. There was nothing left in the system to fire at. He ran the targeting sweep 3 more times to be certain. The passive arrays were clear. The active sweep showed nothing larger than debris. The jump signatures had all dissipated. He stood the 4th round down and he sat back in his chair, and he looked at the ceiling of the fire control room, which was bare rock, the natural stone of the asteroid that had hidden this installation for 31 years. Dr. Ingrid Solberg had been dead for 9 years. She had not lived to see this. He had thought about that, on and off over the years. Whether she would have wanted to see it, whether she would have been glad or horrified or something in between. She had spent 22 years of her life on this project. She had died of cancer at 71, on Earth, in a hospital that had never known what she had spent those 22 years building. He thought about what she had said the first time she stood at the edge of the installation and looked at the stars. Either the smartest thing or the last thing. He looked at his sensor display, the Kepler system, empty of Veth. Both, she had said, could be true at once. He picked up the comm to Earth command and began his report. On Kepler Station, Vasquez sat down. There was not anywhere specifically designated for sitting in the secondary control room. She sat on the floor, with her back against the console, in the red light, and she sat there for a while. Webb sat down next to her without saying anything. Meta from across the room said they're really gone, and Vasquez said yes, and Meta said okay, and nobody said anything else for a little while. 2,041 people were alive on Kepler Station. About 930 were not. Vasquez sat with that number. She sat with it the way you sit with things that are true, and that you cannot change, and that will need to be carried from here forward. There is no other way to sit with numbers like that, you just sit. After a while, Webb said quietly, "What happens now?" She looked at the passive array display, the empty Kepler system, the dissipating plasma fields. "Now," she said, "the galaxy finds out." She paused. "The question is what they decide to do about it." The data from Kepler reached the Sarathi Confederation's Intelligence Directorate in 9 hours. It took them 3 hours after that to believe it. Not because the data was unclear, it was extremely clear, thoroughly documented by 14 different observation posts, cross-referenced against each other until the margin of error was functionally meaningless. The data was not the problem. The problem was that what the data showed required a category of thing that did not exist in the Sarathi Threat Assessment Library, and creating a new category for something requires you to first dismantle the model that told you the thing was impossible. The Sarathi had been watching humanity for 40 years. They had rated humans as a developing civilization, promising in some respects, dangerously short-sighted in others, possessed of considerable individual resourcefulness, but limited in the kind of long-term strategic thinking that characterized stable interstellar powers. They had noted the railgun development, the early energy weapon research, the modular colonial infrastructure. They had assessed humanity's current military capacity as adequate for internal security and piracy suppression, and possibly sufficient for a low-intensity conflict with a second-tier power. The Sarathi Threat Assessment Library had no tier for what had just happened at Kepler. One weapon, hidden for 31 years, fired 3 times. 2 Veth capital ships and 1 frigate reduced to plasma. 18 remaining Veth vessels, including 10 that had not taken any direct fire and had not been in any danger, in full emergency retreat. Senior intelligence analyst Kashari had been awake for 22 hours by the time she sat down to write the report for the High Council. She had a habit, when writing difficult reports, of drafting the first sentence many times until she found one that was honest without being either dramatic or falsely calm. She wrote 7 first sentences for this report. The one she kept was, "The humans have demonstrated a weapons capability that changes the prior assessment in ways this office considers non-recoverable." Non-recoverable meant the old model was not wrong in a way you could fix. The old model was wrong in the foundation. You had to start over. She sent it upward and got 3 hours of sleep and came back to her desk to find 17 response messages waiting from various council offices, all of which asked some version of the same question. Did they know they had this before they were attacked, or did they build it afterward? Kashari had already answered this question in her report, but she answered it again in the 17 reply messages, because she understood why people kept asking it. The answer was profoundly uncomfortable. They had built it 31 years ago. They had built it when the Veth were 400 light-years away, before first contact, before the expansion directive reached their region of space, before there was any specific enemy to build it against. They had built it against the idea of an enemy, against the mathematical probability of a thing that didn't have a face yet. That kind of thinking, that long, patient, unglamorous, expensive, secret kind of thinking, was not what the Sarathi model had predicted humanity was capable of. The model had been wrong about that. What else had it been wrong about? The Veth High Council convened in emergency session 14 hours after Subcommander Vrath's shuttle completed its jump to the home system. Vrath delivered his report in person, which was unusual. Reports from field operations were typically transmitted. He delivered his in person because the transmission, while encrypted, would still travel through communication networks that other parties could eventually access, and the content of the report was the kind of content you did not want traveling through accessible networks before the council had time to process it and form a response. He stood in front of 7 high councilors and he said what had happened. He said it plainly, because that was his nature, and because there was no way to say it that was not plain. The dreadnought, absolute dominion, was gone. The battle cruiser, eternal claim, was gone. The frigate, cold patience, was gone. Combined crew 5,911, all dead. The engagement lasted from first human defensive fire to Veth fleet retreat. 43 minutes. Of that 43 minutes, the actual exchange involving Sovereign had lasted approximately 23 minutes and consisted of 3 projectile impacts. High Counselor Drath, who was the eldest member of the council and had been instrumental in authorizing the 4th expansion directive, was quiet for a long moment after Vrath finished. "You said they hit it," Drath said. "Yes, 31 of their years, based on our reconstruction of the construction timeline from the installation's apparent age and the asteroid modification signatures. 31 years. Drath said it the way you repeat something when you are testing whether it sounds different the second time. It didn't sound different, and we did not detect it. No, why not? Vrath had anticipated this question. He had been thinking about it for the entire jump transit home. Because, he said, we did not look for it. Our pre-engagement scan of the Kepler system was conducted to a standard appropriate for a civilization at their assessed threat level. We were not scanning the outer asteroid fields at resolutions sufficient to detect a concealed structure. We had no intelligence suggesting such a structure existed. Our threat assessment of humanity did not include the possibility of a strategic scale, concealed weapon. The counselors were very quiet. Our threat assessment was wrong, Vrath said, because someone had to say it, and it might as well be him. High Counselor Drath looked at the table. Then he looked up. What is your assessment of the weapon's full capability? We saw 3 rounds fired. The installation appeared to have the capacity for a 4th. The targeting team was tracking a solution on 3 ships when we completed our jumps. The barrel is 412 kilometers. We do not know how many rounds they built. We do not know if there is only 1 installation. Silence. If there is only 1 installation, Drath said. Yes. The silence lasted a long time on Earth. It was morning in the city of Geneva when the preliminary after-action report came in from Kepler Station. Admiral Kira Osman was sitting in a glass-walled office in Earth Defense Force Command, and she was reading the report, and she was thinking about a calculation she had run in her head 6 hours ago when the first sensor data came in, a calculation she hadn't shared with anyone because the inputs were still uncertain, and she didn't state uncertain conclusions out loud. The calculation was this. The Veth had come to Kepler with 22 ships. They had sent 18 away at emergency scatter, and those 18 had jumped out of the system. They had not rallied. They had not sent a message demanding an explanation. They had not issued a counter-threat. They had run, with the speed and totality of something that had been frightened deeply enough to override 600 years of operational confidence. Osman had been in the military for 27 years. She had studied fear and its effects on military decision-making. Her doctoral work had been on it, specifically on how fear functioned differently at the individual level and the institutional level and the civilizational level. At the individual level, fear was fast and sometimes useful. At the civilizational level, fear moved slower but ran much deeper, and when it was established deeply enough, it could reshape strategy, doctrine, the foundational assumptions about who could be touched and who could not. The Veth had been operating on a foundational assumption for 600 years. That there was no cost too high for them to pay, because no one had ever charged them a price they couldn't absorb. Today someone had charged them a price. 3 ships, 5,911 crew. 1 engagement, 18 minutes of active fire. It wasn't the ships that mattered. The Veth could build more ships. It was the principle. It was the shattering of the assumption. It was the discovery that somewhere in the dark, pointing at you, was something you didn't know about, and couldn't see coming, and couldn't stop. Osman picked up her pen and wrote 2 words on the paper in front of her. Now negotiate. She underlined them. Danielle Park was sitting in Bay 9 of Kepler Station, with a blanket around her shoulders and a cup of something that had been labeled as tea but tasted closer to warm tin, and Tomas was asleep against her side. Someone from the medical team had come and taken her arm. She had a fracture in the left wrist from the 2nd suppression salvo, something she hadn't noticed until her adrenaline had done what adrenaline does and then stopped, and wrapped it, and given her something for the pain that made everything soft at the edges, in a way she found more disorienting than the pain had been. She had 11 children in her original group. They were all here, all 11. She thought about that, all 11. It didn't balance the other numbers. It wasn't supposed to. You didn't set 11 against 930 and call it even. But 11 was true, and she was going to hold on to it. Across the bay, she could see Sergeant Webb moving through the space, checking on people, coordinating with the medical staff, doing the kind of constant low-level logistics work that doesn't have a name, but that keeps traumatized groups of people from falling apart. He had been doing it for hours. He hadn't stopped. He caught her eye at one point, and she gave him a small nod, and he gave her one back. That was the whole conversation. That was all it needed to be. On 14 non-human observation platforms, the data had been transmitted upward, and the transmissions had crossed and been received, and the receiving parties were having conversations that would not be public for months or years, but that were all circling the same set of questions. The Helian Confederation, which shared 2 border systems with human space and had fought one low-intensity war with humanity 11 years prior, convened its Security Council 2 days after the engagement. The meeting lasted 6 hours. The record of it, declassified 8 years later, showed that the first item on the agenda was labeled simply, Revaluation of Human Military Capability Assessment. The Palith Coalition, a small group of 3 systems that the Veth had pushed on for a decade but not yet absorbed, received the Kepler data via a deep space relay, and their council spent 4 hours in emergency session. The record showed that their defense ministers stood up at one point and said, in the middle of a complex discussion about resource allocation, we should talk to the humans. It was not on the agenda. Nobody objected. The Garathi, a reclusive species who had not communicated with any other civilization in 40 years, and had specifically refused 3 human contact attempts, sent a message to Earth's Galactic Contact Bureau 3 days after the engagement. It was the first time they had ever initiated contact with humanity. It was brief, it said. We watched. We understand now. We would like to speak. The Contact Bureau forwarded it to Admiral Osman's office with a note that said, This has never happened before. Underlined twice. Osman read it and said nothing for a moment, and then said to the aide who had brought it, Set up a channel. Back on Kepler Station, Commander Vasquez was doing the thing she always had to do after an engagement. The thing was making lists. 2,041 people alive. 930 dead. Of those 930, 612 had been civilians, workers, engineers, families, 318 military personnel, names. She wrote the names. The system would compile them automatically into the official record, but she wrote them anyway, by hand, in the paper notebook she kept specifically for this. It took 4 hours. When she finished, she sat with the notebook open to the last page and looked at the last name she'd written, and thought about the East Module and the shuttle bay and all the ways a station full of people could come apart in 43 minutes. She thought about what she would have done without Sovereign. She thought about 31 years of engineers and physicists and budget officers and project managers who had worked in secret on something they could never talk about, never show anyone, never prove was worth the cost, until the day it was needed. She thought about Dr. Ingrid Solberg, whom she had never heard of until Bosch mentioned her in the after-action communication. A woman who had stood at the edge of an asteroid and asked, what would it take? The answer had been 31 years, and a 400-kilometer barrel, and an immovable belief that someday somebody was going to come and you were going to need to be ready. Vasquez looked at the last name in her notebook. The belief had been right. It hadn't been enough. 930 names said. It hadn't been enough, but it had been the difference between 930 and 3,000, and that difference had a weight to it that she was going to carry with her for the rest of her life. She closed the notebook. She went back to work. In the outer dark of the Kepler system, the plasma fields where the absolute dominion and the eternal claim had been were slowly dissipating. The debris field expanded in all directions, perfectly consistent with the mathematics of what had happened, indifferent to its own meaning. Metal and carbon and the elements that had once been ships and crews spreading through the space between the stars at a constant, unhurried, thoroughly documented rate. In 4 million years, some of that debris would reach other star systems. In 4 million years, some of it would become part of new things, asteroids, dust clouds, eventually perhaps planets, perhaps atmospheres, perhaps rain on worlds that didn't have names yet. The universe was not sentimental about these things, but the people who were alive on Kepler Station were sentimental about them, in the way that humans always were, and always had been, and probably always would be, carrying their numbers and their names and their particular forms of grief through whatever came next. That was the other thing about humans. They remembered, they carried it forward, they kept going. 6 weeks after the Battle of Kepler Station, that was what they were calling it now, officially, in military records and news reports, and the first draft of the emergency UN Security Council resolution that had been sitting in committee since the day after the engagement, Admiral Kira Osman sat down for the first diplomatic contact between humanity and the Veth Dominion. It was not what she had expected a diplomatic contact to look like. She had expected it to be formal, scheduled, conducted through the standard galactic diplomatic channels, with interpreters and recorded minutes, and the kind of careful language that people spent weeks crafting so that no single word could be read two ways by two different parties. She had expected to be in Geneva, in the contact chamber that humanity had built specifically for this kind of communication, with a team of 30 behind her, and a legal advisory panel, and a communications relay that had been calibrated to every known Veth signal format. What she got instead was a direct transmission to her personal command channel at 0340 station time, while she was asleep. The translation came through automatically, which meant the sender had used a format her software recognized, which meant the sender had looked up how to send her a message she could read, which meant the sender had been thinking about this for a while. The message was not long. We are aware that you have one operational weapon of this type. We assess with high probability that you have more. We are asking whether you intend to use them. Osman read it twice. She got up, made herself coffee, and sat with it in the quiet of her quarters, and thought about what answer she wanted to give. The answer she gave after 40 minutes of thinking was not the one her legal advisory panel would have approved. She sent back, "We built them so we would not have to use them. You made us use them once. Whether we have to use them again is your decision, not ours." She sent it and went back to sleep. The response came back 4 hours later, which suggested that someone on the Veth side had also been awake at an inconvenient hour reading a message and thinking about it carefully. It said, "We would like to discuss this further." It was the most human sentence she had ever received from a non-human intelligence. She wrote back, "So would we." The formal discussions took 11 months. They were conducted through standard channels in the galactic diplomatic framework, with interpreters and legal panels and carefully crafted language. Everything Osman had originally expected. All of it preceded by 40 minutes of two people thinking alone in the quiet, and being honest with each other at an indecent hour, which was not how the diplomatic histories would record it, but was in fact how it started. Several things came out of those 11 months. The first was a formal cessation of Veth expansion operations into human proximate space, defined as any system within 40 light-years of currently inhabited human territory. Not a treaty, not yet. A cessation, pending further discussion, with the understanding on both sides that the cessation was in both parties' interest. The second was a mutual disclosure framework, an agreement that both parties would provide the other with information about significant new weapons, development, pending verification protocols that neither side was very satisfied with, but both sides accepted because imperfect verification was better than no verification. The third was a clause that nobody advertised but that both sides understood was the real center of the whole thing, an acknowledgement that humanity possessed and maintained strategic weapons capable of causing unacceptable loss to Veth military assets, and a parallel acknowledgement that Veth expansion activities had been halted in the relevant region. Neither side used the word deterrence. Both sides knew that was the word. When Osman briefed the UN Security Council on the outline of the agreement, a delegate from one of the council nations asked her if she considered the outcome a victory. She thought about that for a moment. 930 people died at Kepler Station, she said. A lot of them were civilians. They died because we weren't ready fast enough, because our defenses weren't strong enough, because the evacuation capacity wasn't sufficient. The weapon worked, but working isn't the same as winning. Winning would have been not needing it. A pause. We have a framework now. Whether that becomes something real depends on what we do with it. She paused again. Ask me in 10 years, she said. Sub-Commander Vrath was reassigned after his report to the High Council. Not punished. His conduct had been correct. His report had been accurate. There was nothing to punish. He was reassigned because his assessment of what had happened had been the clearest and most honest of any officer who had been present at Kepler. And the High Council did not currently want their clearest and most honest officers in positions where they might influence junior officers to be similarly clear and honest. He was placed in a strategic analysis post, behind a desk, reading reports from other people's engagements rather than being in them. He spent his first 6 months in that post, doing something that had not been formally requested of him, a complete retrospective analysis of the human-Veth engagement from first contact to the fleet's retreat, tracing every decision point and every place where a different decision might have produced a different outcome. It was 1,200 pages when he finished. The section he spent pushed the most time on was not the weapons analysis or the tactical breakdown or the assessment of Sovereign's construction and capabilities. It was a 5-page section near the end titled, in dry bureaucratic language, Reassessment of Subject Civilization's Strategic Decision-Making Capacity. The core of it was simple. The Veth had assessed humanity as a civilization that could not plan long-term. That was not correct. Humanity had planned 31 years in advance for an enemy they had not yet encountered. They had maintained operational security on a 400-kilometer weapons installation for 3 decades. They had absorbed the attack on Kepler Station, sustained catastrophic damage, and used the weapon at exactly the correct moment, not too early, not when it might have been detected and neutralized before it could fire, but at the moment of maximum need and maximum surprise. That was not an absence of long-term strategic thinking. That was exceptional long-term strategic thinking, conducted in secret, at great expense, across multiple political administrations and budget cycles and personnel transitions, by a civilization that the Veth had looked at and seen something small and manageable. Vrath sent his analysis to the High Council and waited. 3 weeks later, a member of the council called him in to discuss it. The member's first question was, "How many other weapons do you believe they have hidden that we do not know about?" Vrath's answer was honest, as his answers always were. "I don't know. That is exactly the problem." Sergeant Marcus Webb took his leave on Earth, in Chicago, in the late summer, 4 months after the engagement. He spent the first week sleeping. Not in any troubled way. He would deal with the troubled parts later, with help he had scheduled. Just in the way that you sleep when you have been running on adrenaline and duty, and the particular focused energy of survival for longer than your body was designed to sustain it. He slept. He ate food that was not station rations. He sat on the back steps of his mother's house and looked at the sky, Chicago sky. Blue above the lake, not the black of space, not the red emergency lighting, not the dust-filtered amber of a mining colony. Blue and wide and completely ordinary. He sat there for a long time. His mother came out at one point and sat next to him. She didn't ask anything. She was the kind of person who understood that questions were not always what was needed. After a while he said, "There was a kid, 6 years old. His name was Tomas." She waited. "He's okay," Webb said. "He's with his aunt now. His mother didn't make it, but he's okay." She put her hand over his. He looked at the sky. He had been thinking a lot in the months since Kepler about the moment in the maintenance corridor when he had found Danielle Park with 11 children in a line. She had said okay, and turned around and organized them, and followed him, and not one of those children had panicked or been left behind. She had done that in the middle of a bombardment, alone, with no orders, using training she hadn't used in 8 years. He had been thinking about what it said that she'd done that. Not about her specifically. About the kind of people who ended up in places like Kepler Station, working contracts, mining colonies, refueling installations at the edges of where humanity had gotten to. Not soldiers, not heroes in any formal sense, just people who had enough in them to turn around in a crisis and do the next right thing. There were a lot of those people. The galaxy had looked at humans for a while, he thought. It had looked at the technology and the firepower and the strategic weapons. That was reasonable. Those were real things. But it was also looking at a species that put civilians in supply closets and told a 6-year-old yes, when it didn't know if yes was true. That carried notebooks full of names. That built guns for 31 years against enemies they couldn't see yet, and then sat with the cost of using them because sitting with the cost was what you did. That was also real. He stayed on his mother's steps until the sky went dark. Stars came out one by one. He knew some of them now in ways he hadn't before Kepler, knew which ones had systems around them, which ones were contested, which ones humanity was inching toward. There were a lot of stars. There was a lot of dark. Somewhere in it, humanity was still moving. Commander Vasquez was at Kepler Station when it reopened, not the old station, that had been assessed as too structurally compromised for full rehabilitation. A new station, built in the same position, on the same coordinates, same designation, same purpose. Faster construction than the original, because a lot of the preparatory work had already been done. Faster than you would expect if you didn't know how humans worked. 3,000 people had been on the old station. 4,000 were assigned to the new one. Nobody had asked Vasquez to be there for the reopening. It wasn't her command anymore. She had been promoted, moved to Earth Defense Force Strategic Command. given a role that involved a lot of reports and not much sleeping. She had asked for one day off and taken a shuttle to Kepler on her own, and she was standing in the new operations center, which was larger and better lit than the old one, and smelled like new construction materials and recycled air. Lieutenant Priya Mehta was there too. Mehta was the new station's senior sensor officer. She had come back. They stood in the new operations center and looked at the new sensor display, and didn't say much for a while. The passive arrays are better, Mehta said eventually. Good. Longer range, different positioning. And we have 2 of them now, covering opposite sides of the system. She paused. We also have directed energy defense arrays, 4 of them. And the shield generator is 3 generations newer. Vasquez looked at the display, the Kepler system, showing clean on every frequency. And the evacuation capacity, she asked. Enough for everyone, plus 40%. Vasquez nodded. She looked at the console where Mehta had stood, 11 seconds before anyone else knew the Veth were there, and said, "Oh no," in a voice that was mostly breath, and hit the alarm anyway. The console was new. Different placement, different hardware, but the same station, the same people more or less, the same stars outside. "Good work," she said. Mehta nodded. The galaxy did not become safe after Kepler. Nobody had said it would. The Veth Dominion did not dissolve. The other civilizations watching from their observation posts did not disarm. The long, slow work of living in a universe full of other things that could decide at any time that you were an acceptable acquisition cost did not stop. What changed was smaller and, in the long run, possibly more important. The Paleth Coalition sent a formal diplomatic request to Earth Command 8 months after the engagement. They wanted a trade agreement. They also, in a carefully worded annex, wanted to know if humanity would consider extending mutual defense consultations to small neighboring powers. It was the first time anyone had asked humanity for that kind of help. Earth Command spent 4 months discussing the answer. The answer they gave was cautious and incomplete and full of the kinds of qualifications that diplomatic answers are full of when the people writing them are being genuinely careful. But the core of it was yes. The Garathi, who had not communicated with anyone in 40 years, sent 3 more messages in the 8 months after their first one. By the 3rd message, they were asking about cultural exchange. A species that had chosen isolation for 4 decades was wondering what humans read. Senior analyst Kashari of the Sarathi Confederation completed her revaluation of humanity's threat assessment classification. She submitted it to the Intelligence Directorate with a cover note that she had spent more time writing than the report itself. The cover note said, "The error was not that we underestimated their weapons. The error was that we were looking at the weapons. The weapons are what you see when you're afraid of something. What you should look at is what kind of thing is afraid enough to build them, and what kind of thing, having built them, still tries to negotiate." The directorate stamped it classified and filed it. Kashari made a personal copy. On a hill above Geneva, on a Tuesday evening in late autumn, Admiral Kira Osman sat on a bench and looked at the city below and thought about the message she had sent at 0340 in the morning 6 months ago. "We built them so we would not have to use them." She thought about whether that was true. It had been true when Solberg's team started building Sovereign, 31 years ago, when the Veth were 400 light years away and the idea of them was still theoretical. She believed it had stayed true through the construction and the maintenance and the 31 years of not using it. She believed it had been true when Bosch's hand was on the authorization key. And then they had used it, and the math had worked out the way the math was designed to work out. 3 rounds fired, 18 ships in retreat, cessation agreement, framework discussions, framework becoming something not quite a treaty but pointed in that direction. The math had worked. 930 names in a notebook had worked. Both things were true at once. They had always both been true at once. That was not something she had figured out. It was something that Ingrid Solberg had figured out before her. Standing at the edge of an asteroid, and had said plainly, either the smartest thing or the last thing, and maybe both, she looked at the city, lights coming on in the windows, the sky doing the specific thing it did at this hour, going from the deep blue that wasn't quite dark to the dark that was fully dark, stars appearing in it one by one. Human cities at night looked like this from every hill above every city on Earth, lights and streets and people, and all the ordinary continuous business of being alive and keeping things going. You could love it. You could find it mundane. On any given night it was both. On this particular night, having just spent 6 months in the opening phase of negotiations that might, if everyone worked very hard and made very careful decisions over a long time, eventually become something resembling stability. She looked at it and found it neither mundane nor extraordinary. Just true. Just the thing that was there. She sat with it until the stars were fully out. And then she went back to work. Out in the Kepler system, the new station's running lights blinked orange and white in the dark, the same colors as the old one. New hardware, same colors, same position, same designation. A 3-month-old child, born to 2 engineers on the new station, was asleep in a habitat module on level 4. Her name was Ingrid. Her parents had not known anyone named Ingrid. They had chosen the name because they liked the sound of it. The Kepler system was quiet. The stars were the same stars they had always been. And somewhere in the outer asteroid field, in a chamber carved from rock and cable, pointing at the sky, was a barrel 412 kilometers long, loaded, patient, ready if it was ever needed again. It might not be needed again. 31 years of work for 3 rounds fired. That was an acceptable ratio, if what came after the 3 rounds was something worth having. The question of whether what came after was worth having was not a question answered by guns or by math or by the physics of kinetic impactors at 68% of the speed of light. It was answered slowly, by people at desks writing difficult reports, by diplomatic channels and careful language and months of work that didn't make good stories, by a sergeant on his mother's back steps looking at the sky, by an analyst who made personal copies of things she thought mattered, by a woman keeping 11 children calm in a supply closet in the middle of a bombardment, saying yes when she didn't know if yes was true, by all of it, by the whole long human habit of keeping going. That was the answer. That had always been the answer.